Thank you, everyone. First up, I know absolutely nothing about EO safety. So today what I want to talk about is something completely different, which is Australia's strategic outlook. What is the nature of the region we're in and where it's going? And things are not looking good, I have to say. So let me prepare you for a fairly grim presentation, and then I'm happy to engage in Q&A afterwards. Here are the key points that I want to get across. Australia's strategic outlook is deteriorating. We're seeing adverse strategic change that is happening faster than anticipated in the 2016 White Paper. And you may have seen the Minister of Defence, Linda Reynolds, note in the recent CPOW conference in Sydney that there is a defence review underway given this unexpected change. And so that review is now looking at how we can adjust policy in the face of greater strategic risk. I think that we are certainly in a period of strategic warning, and I would go so far to say as we're in a pre-war period. So how do we respond to what looks to be a dark and dangerous future? And I don't think that we can assume that more of the same, or indeed the assumptions that underpinned the 2016 White Paper and the accompanying integrated investment program will suffice in this more adverse security outlook. So we have to start thinking about updating our policies. And what are the key trends we need to be worried about? The first is the return of major power warfare. At the end of the Cold War, there was this gentleman called Francis Fukuyama who wrote this very supposed influential paper called The End of History, which suggested that democracy had won. There was never going to be any further major power interstate warfare, and therefore we could all rest easy and focus on nation building and democracy building and so forth. And really the threats that we faced were failed states and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief issues. Well, that's wrong, obviously. We went through this period in the 1990s through to the late 2000s of a unipolar moment that was US-led. That's ended decisively, and we are now in a period of competitive multipolarity where you have major peer adversaries, China and Russia, that are challenging US strategic primacy across the Indo-Pacific and seeking to overturn the US-led rules-based international order to create a China-centered world order. So we are in the contest of our times in the same way that I think we were during the Cold War. And I think that the strategic outlook that we face today can be quite nicely compared in many respects to the period of the 1930s, when we had rising military powers challenging democracies, and we were looking down the barrel of major power conflict. Then, in the same way, we are looking down the barrel of major power conflict in the next 2 decades, I would say. So we have this rising assertive China that's intent on overturning US strategic primacy. They have this China dream, which is the rejuvenation of China as a rich country with a strong army that in effect is a reassertion of where China sees its rightful place as a new middle kingdom that exists within what they call a community of common destiny that is in effect a China-centered world order. Alongside China, we also have to worry about Russia. It's a revanchist power, which means it's seeking to overturn the outcome of the Cold War. It's challenging NATO in particular and interfering in US and European internal political affairs. Expect the Russians to fully interfere with the 2020 presidential election, and also they are actively involved in trying to interfere with British political affairs associated around Brexit. You're seeing, I think, interestingly, the emergence of a China-Russia axis. A few years ago, people were discussing this and they were dismissing it because they said that both sides had differences and that if it happened, it would be a marriage of convenience, ending in a messy and nasty divorce. In actual fact, what the debate seems to be trending towards now is a more solid axis where Moscow and Beijing can coordinate their actions, share technology to undermine and frustrate the US and its allies. So that's something that I think we need to think about, because it is going to be a fairly dramatic transformation to our strategic outlook. But one of the ways which both Russia and China are acting against us is through what's known as grey zone political warfare. And this includes acting at a level below that which would justify a military response. It includes use of deception, disinformation, influence operations, cyber attack, media operations, lawfare, a whole range of capabilities that, for the Chinese in particular, there is no peace or war, there is only struggle. And they use political warfare and grey zone activities as a way of weakening and undermining the US and its allies. Some people have said that this period that we're in now is not another Cold War because there's no ideological dimension to this contest. I would actually disagree with that. What you're seeing in particular is China promoting a new type of developmental model in the form of authoritarianism with capitalism to developing states, and trying to gain their support through this idea of you can be rich and prosperous, but you don't have to have democratic reforms. And that essentially constitutes an ideological challenge to Western liberal democracy, and in particular the rules-based international order. And in the face of this challenge, we are seeing the question of, can the centre hold? Can Western liberal democracies stand up to this challenge? At the moment, rather worryingly, there is an absence of Western leadership, in particular focused around uncertainty over just what President Donald Trump stands for and how he governs. The US national security community in Washington, DC is as rock solid as ever. Our relationship with the Americans is strong and getting stronger, but there is uncertainty over the man at the top in the Oval Office and just how he thinks, where he gets advice from, is it through Fox and Friends each morning, and how a tweet can undermine international security in fairly dramatic ways. So that uncertainty, I think, is worrying enough. I think there's longer-term uncertainty about the US and foreign and defence policy, though, particularly in terms of some of their long-term fiscal challenges and the partisan nature of US politics that could actually make it more difficult for the US to sustain a prolonged period of strategic competition with China and Russia going into the 2020s and the 2030s. So for allies like Australia, we have to start thinking about scenarios whereby maybe the US either can't be there for us or retreats to an offshore balancer role, and how do we respond to that in terms of our defence policy and force structure and so forth. It's called the Plan B debate, and it's an ongoing debate that's underway. There certainly is a weakening of the post-war rules-based international order that is the basis of Western and US power, and a reversal of globalisation. And that's matched by an erosion of the Western alliance system that's also weakening, and a weakening of non-proliferation norms. So at that fundamental level, we're not only seeing a threat from without, we're seeing the risk of diminution of strength and resolve from within. And I remind you of the fall of Rome, where Rome fell because it was rotted from within and overwhelmed by major powers around it. So I think the gloomy prediction here is that we are in a pre-war period, and the potential for major power interstate war is at its highest since the end of the Cold War in 1991. We're certainly in a very dangerous period. I think there are a number of regional flashpoints that we need to be aware of, notably the Korean Peninsula and Iran, and the prospect for a Chinese move against Taiwan in the next few years. Let me say a few points about each. We've been in a period of diplomacy between the US and North Korea for some years now. That diplomacy is failing, and it's probably dead. And so the question is, what happens when ultimately North Korea decides that it's no longer worth trying for diplomacy with the US? They've indicated or implied that they will go back to launching test launches of long-range ballistic missiles and potentially doing nuclear testing as well. They've hinted at the prospect of a Juche bird test, which is an atmospheric nuclear test over the North Pacific. If that happens, then I think that President Trump would have no alternative but to go back to Fire and Fury Mark II, that the last time he was doing that was 2017. So 2020 could be a very dangerous year on the peninsula as tensions go back up. And certainly I think there is broad consensus amongst all reputable North Korea watchers that North Korea has no intention whatsoever under any circumstances of getting rid of its nuclear weapons. So the notion that somehow they'll give up nuclear weapons for economic investment is misguided. On Iran, we are seeing a slow slide to military conflict as Iran decides that it's no longer worth sticking by JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, given the Americans under Trump have walked away from it. So the Iranians are gradually reintroducing the ability to enrich uranium and potentially breaking out in a fairly slow and steady way. But the Americans, the Israelis and the Saudis will not let Iran get nuclear weapons. So I would see the potential for a rising crisis in the Middle East in 2020 that could potentially end in a military conflict between the US and its partners against Iran. And Taiwan, finally, I think is probably one of the most worrying scenarios. The Chinese have been launching sort of provocative air and naval maneuvers around the island for the last 2 years. Expect that to rise in 2020 in the lead up to the Taiwanese presidential election. It's likely, given Hong Kong, that President Tsai, the current president of Taiwan, will win that election, and that will undermine any chance of any sort of peaceful negotiated settlement towards reunification. So you could see the risk of a Chinese military move against Taiwan in the years following the 2020 presidential election, which would then have implications if the US come to Taiwan's aid for Australia becoming involved in that conflict against China. So we need to think about that prospect. We focus on the high-end interstate major power conflicts because they're, I think, the most challenging and the most dangerous, but we also need to look at the security complexity that's occurring at the lower level. We're always going to have the threat of terrorism and international terrorism driven by radical jihadist ideology. That's pervasive across the Middle East and North Africa, and it's likely to spread into Southeast Asia and states like the southern Philippines, potentially Indonesia, and so forth. And so there is a growing risk that organisations like Islamic State could resurface at some point, and once again we are faced with that threat. That's never going to go away, so we have to always meet that. But we also now face the growing risk of accelerating climate change. It's happening faster than we all anticipated. It's having the potential for generating severe and dangerous weather events that could create risk to life and property. But in the longer term, the risk of global warming accelerating above 1.5 or 2 degrees globally is that sections of the planet will become uninhabitable. They'll simply be too hot. Now we worry about 300 people on a people smuggling ship coming to northern Australia. I don't know how we respond to 10 million, 20 million, 30 million people heading south because the equatorial regions are simply too hot to live in. They have to go somewhere, and I don't think the Chinese will let them in. So it's more likely that we're going to see a severe mass migration crisis in our northern region in coming years and decades as a result of climate change, and that could generate climate-driven conflicts and wars as a real challenge for us to come to grips with. And there's also strategic shocks and technological black swans that we need to think about. What are the potential implications for radical shifts in technology that we're simply not prepared for? We're all talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum technology, potential for nanotechnology to transform means of production. The Chinese government is investing in genetic engineering research to augment humans. So how we deal with these sorts of technological black swans that could transform our way of life and transform human society and transform humans is something that I don't think a lot of people are ready for. But it's also potential military implications of these new technologies changing how the character and conduct of warfare occurs, creating maximum gun moments whereby traditional powers that had military advantages in certain areas are then locked out of future warfare because we see radical new technologies emerging. With all of that, I think the key challenge is the challenge represented by China, arising in China. And I want to quickly go through some points here on that. On the Chinese dream and the restoration of China as the Middle Kingdom, this is of critical importance to President Xi and to his longevity in power. Obviously, he's claimed his right to be president for life, but if he doesn't achieve some of the objectives of the China dream, then he's not going to last in that position. So he seeks a rich country with a strong army that is the centre of a new Chinese-led global order. It's key to a global future where Chinese approaches to development and governance are presented as an alternative to the norms of democracy. And so, as I said, this is an ideological challenge that we're facing here and now on a level, I think, that is equivalent to the challenge posed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. A key way for China to expand its influence is along the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. It's a means for China to assert geopolitical interests across not only Central Asia and into Europe, across that Eurasian landmass, but also through the Indian Ocean and into the Southwest Pacific as well. Political warfare is something that I think is going to be a day-to-day challenge for us, but also how do we deal with debt trap diplomacy in the South Pacific, where China essentially gets small, weak states heavily addicted to debt, and then when they can't pay that debt back, basically says, right, we'll take assets in the form of a port or an airport that we can then use to expand our influence and our presence. But whilst that sounds really challenging, and it is facing headwinds, and it's not everything is going in China's favour. The Chinese state in particular, and by the Chinese state I mean the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, the organs of state security such as the Ministry of State Security and also the PLA, are an insecure political identity. They fear their own people, and when you look at, for example, the social credit system where everyone has a social credit score, and if you don't say the right things and are not supportive enough of the Chinese regime, your social credit score goes down, and so you're denied sort of normal benefits of life as a citizen. That's a sign of Chinese political vulnerability because the Chinese government doesn't trust its people. I can't imagine an Australian government imposing social credit on the Australian people. There's a wealth gap between the urban elites, where you see the very rich, versus the rural poor, that's creating real social unrest across China. And there's the whole issue of the impact of the one-child policy, where China is likely to get old before it gets rich. That's going to generate severe economic problems for China in coming years, particularly as its debt to GDP ratio undermines China's ability to sustain prosperity and growth. And there's internal resistance within the Chinese Communist Party to Xi, because many in the Chinese Communist Party see Xi's claim to power and his one-man rule in a very Maoist style as undermining their ability to rise to the top. So the question is, what happens if the China dream fails? Do we see civil unrest spreading across China? Do we see the factionalization and fragmentation of China? That's a possibility that we have to be thinking about. Let me now turn to the PLA, which I think is of key importance for Australia. When you look at the PLA, they are currently in a process of balancing between a need to pursue a counter-invention strategy based around anti-access and air denial systems. We've seen them develop those and deploy those, versus building power projection forces to be able to protect Chinese interests globally. So that's a challenge for the PLA that's going to get worse as economic growth goes down and they have to make some hard choices about where to invest money. There certainly is a broad emphasis on building what they call informatized local war capabilities. In other words, what we take for granted in military affairs, a joint and integrated capability that is information enabled. They're building that now, and they're seeking to develop that capability. But from their perspective, having access to the very best technologies, particularly in breakthrough areas such as hypersonics, unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, machine learning, nanotechnology, all of that, they seek to access that through access to Western providers. And in particular, the concern is that they are accessing Western universities, including here in Australia, to grab technology. The Chinese sent 300 undocumented, undeclared PLA officers into Australian universities over the last few years to basically access our technology and take it back to China. And that's something that is of grave concern to the security agencies of this country. You're also seeing China transforming its strategic culture away from what used to be a continental mindset of a continental power with an emphasis on land forces to focus on maritime power and strategic air power, with the PLA Navy, the PLA Air Force, the PLA Rocket Forces, and the PLA Strategic Support Forces, which focus on space and electronic warfare and cyber, assuming greater importance in the Central Military Commission. So the PLA SSF, the Strategic Support Forces, are far more important now than what they used to be. The Chinese recognise space as a centre of gravity in every sense, and so they're acquiring the space support capabilities in terms of C4ISR, electronic warfare and PNT, to be able to give the Chinese military that informatized capability. At the same time, they're also developing counter-space capabilities to deny us access to our critical space support. And that means that we need to be prepared for a situation where prior to or at the outset of a future military conflict, the Chinese will attack our satellites and will deny us our space capabilities using hard kill and soft kill anti-satellite weapons. They have the weapons, they're deploying them, they're developing the doctrine to use them. And so that's a real area of concern. It's my key area of research, and I think that the Australian Department of Defence, along with the US, the Brits, the French, the Japanese, are starting to take seriously the prospect for warfare in space. And so when you look at how Chinese military modernisation is proceeding, they are closing the qualitative gap in key areas, and they're fast closing up the quantitative gap as well. And so you, for example, you could have a quantitative balance, at least in terms of naval capabilities, with the US by the 2030s. And the possibility of the Chinese Navy being larger than the US Navy and comparable in qualitative terms shortly thereafter. And that would send a huge strategic political signal to the region if suddenly the most powerful Navy in the world is not the US Navy, it's the PLA Navy. Having said all of that, they're not 10 feet tall. They remain untested in an operational sense. They haven't really fought any wars since the 1979 invasion of Vietnam, when they didn't do so well. And so therefore they're having to make up for that shortfall with a lot of exercises that are becoming increasingly realistic in a sense of information operations, joint integrated operations, aggressor forces, the sort of things that we take for granted. They're now starting to do, because they realise that if they go into a future war without those skills, once again it's going to be probably a repetition of 1979. The other challenge they face is that as China's economic growth slows, their ability to sustain military modernisation will also come under challenge. Their defence spending is continuing to increase, but at slowing rates. And so as they're battling this challenge, they have to address capability gaps in terms of strategic mobility, force sustainment, particularly at sea, anti-submarine warfare, and I would also add in there recruitment and training of skilled personnel, because a lot of young people in China these days want to make their fortunes in the financial industry or the tech industry rather than going into the PLA. Geography may be on China's side, however, and that may compensate for some of these challenges. So from the perspective of China, and I'm talking a lot about China because it is really the critical key challenge we face. we're seeing rapid growth of advanced military capabilities. Here's some imagery of the parade on October 1st of this year, of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And that system up there, the DF-17, was probably the highlight of the parade. It's the world's first operationally deployed hypersonic glide vehicle that will potentially threaten our naval ability to project naval power into the Western Pacific, because hypersonic weapons, we simply don't have the time to respond to a threat when it appears. You're starting to see sophisticated drone capabilities, advanced space capabilities, swarming technologies. A lot of people say, well, look, in this parade, they wheeled out all this stuff, but how do we know it's not just mock-ups? I don't think the Chinese would do that, because they would know that every single intelligence analyst in the US would be going over those images with a fine-tooth comb, and they would quickly pick up mock-ups. So it actually wouldn't be in their interest to try that. There's the tyranny of distance point I was making earlier. The Chinese, with anti-access out to Guam, do have an advantage here in that they can project power very quickly, whilst the US Navy has to steam a long way to get their assets into range, because the US has overinvested in short-range tactical platforms. That's a debate that's now breaking out here in Australia about whether we need to have long-range strike capabilities. Incidentally, in regards to Australia, with US forces operating from Australian bases in time of war, we need to be prepared to defend those bases against Chinese ballistic and cruise missile attack, because they will not let US forces operate from Australia unmolested. A2AD, as I said, is really critical. Their ability to raise the cost of entry for US forces intervening in a crisis, with the sort of threats that we're seeing with DF-17 and DF-26, the sensor-to-shooter architectures that they're establishing using space capabilities, advanced unmanned aerial vehicles. All of this is creating the risk that we simply won't be able to get our forces within range in time in order to be able to respond to a challenge by China against Taiwan. And it just gets worse, because we're now facing hypersonic weapons, we're facing advanced swarming systems and advanced space capabilities. And that's generating the perception of a strategic shift that suggests maybe the US is weakening and the US and the Chinese are getting stronger. I don't necessarily think it's that black or white, but in the region, maybe that's the perception. In terms of space, it's very clear that the Chinese are developing capabilities to attack our satellites. This quote from the PLA Academy of Military Science, the 2013 Science and Military Strategy on Space, says, China would strive to attack first at the campaign and tactical levels in order to maintain a space battlefield initiative, and that the intent should be to conceal concentration of forces and make a decisive large-scale first strike. So they are developing the means to be able to carry out what people call a space Pearl Harbor, whereby at the outset of a conflict they strike our space capabilities, and suddenly we're left deaf, dumb and blind, and we're forced into a military disadvantage that they can then exploit. And there's a number of counter-space capabilities emerging that the Chinese are investing in. The emphasis, I think, is going to be increasingly on soft kill, because no one wants to physically shred satellites and create orbital debris fields that then deny space to everyone. But the other concern has to be dual-role grey zone capabilities in space, whereby the Chinese can use commercial systems for example, on-orbit refueling and repair as, in effect, a co-orbital ASAT that can then approach a target and attack that target from close range. So that real issue of a grey zone in orbit is something that we're now having to think about. How do we respond to that? Ground-based capabilities, jamming, spoofing, laser dazzling, and cyber attack on satellites is another area that's going to rapidly expand. And if you want to understand more about this, those 3 documents here are excellent reading. And so when we think about PLA anti-access and air denial from an Australian perspective, we're right in the front line. We're no longer in a strategic backwater, we are right in harm's way as Chinese A2AD capabilities expand. And at the same time, going back to what I said at the beginning, the Chinese are balancing between that anti-access and air denial capability versus their power projection capability to be able to project interests along the Belt and Road Initiative in particular along the 21st century maritime Silk Road here into the Indian Ocean. So expect to see a much greater Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean and within our air and maritime approaches. And they're extending that into the South Pacific as well. They recognise the potential to grow commercial influence and presence in the South Pacific, then gives them the ability down the track, if they wanted to be able to deploy military forces into the South Pacific. And so the concern has to be that one day we'll wake up to the news that the PLA Navy are basing out of Vanuatu or PNG or the Solomon Islands. And that fundamentally changes our strategic equation, because suddenly we now need to think about how we defend the eastern seaboard against attack, something we've not had to think about since 1942. And so we think about this prospect of a major power conflict. It's going to be really bad if it happens, and so we have to work hard to deter the Chinese from challenging our interests. And we can't afford to allow situation to get out of control whereby the economic damage would be immense, generating widespread political instability. Asia is the centre of the global economy in the 21st century. If a conflict happens, the global economic damage would be horrendous, but at the same time, we have to balance the risk of that with the need to prevent China from expanding its influence across the region. That's the trade routes which add to that. Let me now look beyond China and finish up with some global risks in terms of technology and non-traditional security. I think that we are facing the prospect of technological surprises and a maximum gun moment, whereby traditional tools of warfare, ships, aircraft, tanks, are starting to be challenged by these leap-ahead technologies. Hypersonic weapons could potentially make it impossible for naval service combatants to survive. Swarming unmanned autonomous systems, exploiting artificial intelligence, could overwhelm large legacy platforms like tanks on the battlefield and make it impossible for infantry to survive. It's these sorts of new types of capabilities that we're seeing that could transform our understanding of how warfare is thought, in the same way that the combination of technology and innovation in the 1930s transformed warfare in the Second World War with Blitzkrieg. And we did the same thing in the 1990s with the use of precision and information to move away from the sort of industrial era warfare towards knowledge-based warfare. Well, what happens in the 2030s when some of these new technologies like directed energy weapons, hypersonics, space capabilities and so forth really start to impact? The potential for confluent impact, where multiple technologies are coming together to create new and entirely unexpected outcomes, I think is something that really is important, because it could transform not only warfare but our strategic environment. So a breakthrough, for example, in artificial intelligence and the ability to use nanotechnology to generate room temperature superconductors could suddenly open up prospects for solving the problem of nuclear fusion, which means we have clean, everlasting power forever. Does that change things for the better or for the worse? It depends on who controls that technology. 2020 civil space technology could suddenly transform our ability to do things in space that we couldn't even dreamed of doing in the past. So the potential for disruptive innovation, sudden events that transform how we think about military conflict and how we think about war, shocks that then mean we have to respond after the fact and adjust or be locked out, I think is something that really we should be confronting and dealing with now. Black swans are much more difficult because we can't predict those. Whether it's something like a new type of weapon of mass destruction like genetically enhanced biological weapons, or some form of new technology emerging out of the sort of the cutting edge of quantum physics, we can't predict black swans, but they could potentially transform not only society but warfare. And this chart out of Defence Science and Technology is really interesting because it shows the technology trends over time out to 2100. And I think sort of we're all familiar with computer technology, where that's going, with artificial intelligence probably reaching its plateau around 2050, biotechnology and materials. The one that really grabs me as a space geek, I suppose, is space with cheap lift. We are starting to see companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin obviously demonstrating the ability to do reusable rocket launch. That dramatically drops the cost of getting access into orbit, which means suddenly we can do far more with space if we can exploit that line, because we can, the cost of getting into orbit gets a lot less, so that we can actually put payload up there. And that has all sorts of military as well as strategic implications. Finally, geopolitical opportunity and risk. Climate change, as I talked about, is a real concern, but that generates growing risk of pandemics. Mass urbanisation is something that we need to think about in terms of the battle space, technological shocks, and how all of these come together to boost economic growth in the future. Let me finish up with some implications for defence planning. We face a deteriorating security outlook. That's pretty obvious. The assumptions that we assumed would be good for the next 30 years died very quickly after the 2016 white paper. So we do need to review where policy is, and we can't just do a drift forward on the status quo. We need to think about how we shape our relationship with the US. It's going to become more and more difficult to balance between our essential strategic relationship with the US and our vital trading relationship with China. I don't think we'll be able to maintain that balance for much longer, and I think we do need to strengthen the US relationship because of the nature of the Chinese challenge. But we have to think about the prospect of what happens if things go horribly bad and suddenly we can't count on the US anymore. And there are two key problems that potentially could confound us: protracted acquisition cycles and obvious capability gap in the 2020s, in particular long-range strategic strike and reach. So some steps going forward: we should certainly engage more significantly with the US, even with the Trump administration, because we have to look past Trump. We should reinforce the importance of US extended nuclear deterrence, strengthen the relationships with our key Asian partners in the hub and spokes, allow greater access to the US to Australian facilities, including naval forces into Fremantle and long-range air power into the Northern Territory, adopt a more robust and visible forward operating posture, a forward defence in depth that doesn't necessarily have the sea air gap to our north as the end point, but essentially as the starting point, and explore additional defence capability options to make all this practical. And we have to ask the question, are we equipping for the last war? Is the investments that we're making now really right for the technologies that we're likely to see in the next 2 decades? Unmanned systems are going to be really important, and yet Navy is not really keen to invest in large unmanned underwater vehicles for some strange reason, even though the Americans and the Brits are doing exactly that. Speed and mass are coming back. It's no longer just about knowledge, it's about how we can exploit speed and mass. And swarming systems and drones, I think, are going to transform warfare in ways that we can't possibly imagine. So we have to think about how we innovate and use these new types of capabilities. And how does that change command and leadership? Logistics obviously will be transformed, particularly through fourth industrial revolution processes such as 3D printing. Decision times, command cycle will be compressed to the point whereby human control becomes a liability. So we really do have to ask the hard question, do we hand over power to the machine? Our adversaries will probably do that. They have no ethical, moral or legal argument to have. We have to go through that ethical, moral and legal issue within our societies. So for the moment, humans remain on the loop, but for how long? And hypersonics, I think, add to that. So we're seeing probably in the future a race to the swift, whereby the side that strikes first in future war wins. And so we may need to go faster, see deeper and strike further in order to counteract that threat. And I'll finish there and I'll take questions.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Malcolm. I heard your point about the Chinese social credit scheme and how that might not work in Australia. I disagree. We just call it the beer economy instead. So it's a little bit different to the one that they probably run. I'll open up the floor to questions now, and we've got a couple of microphones roaming around. Did anybody want to get the attention of... There we go, one up top right.
I guess defense has moved over the last 10 to 20 years much more to military off the shelf, and that's made it more difficult for us to be a smart defense customer indigenously. What strategic risks is this procurement approach putting on Australia, or any? How do you view that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that military off the shelf is probably better than Australianised versions of military hardware because they've been disasters every time. But you're right in the sense that the more we buy off the shelf, the less we can develop local capabilities to develop advanced systems ourselves. I mean, obviously the naval shipbuilding industry is a step forward to counter that. But I would say that what we need to start doing is investing in the high-tech sector as well. We shouldn't just be doing shipbuilding. We should be investing in how, for example, Australia can exploit and develop its own unmanned aerial systems, advanced guided munitions, space capabilities. You've got a rapidly growing space industry sector in this country that could contribute a lot of the space capabilities that Australia's Defence Forces needs, rather than constantly relying on the US to provide that. So I think that whilst defence industry is focused on shipbuilding, it generates jobs in politically important states, we need to take a more strategic perspective on this and start thinking about how we can become a smarter defence industry power, and that means investing in the high technology sector and starting to really use some of the expertise in this country to try new things, including unmanned systems, hypersonics, that sort of thing. We shouldn't just focus on the naval shipbuilding, and in my mind there's been an overemphasis on naval shipbuilding, which I think needs to be corrected. I hope that answers your question.
Your large land mass, what are your resources? With your large land mass, what are your resources in like minerals and things like that the Chinese actually have?
Yeah. Are you asking in terms of
rare earths, things like that?
Yeah.
That you need for the future, that you need for electronics and things like that. You seem to have a huge land mass. I wonder, is it?
The Chinese are clearly investing into that industry, into the mining sector, and obviously we're exporting minerals to them. I think we have to be smart in how we do that, but we also have to ensure that we have sovereign control over our critical resources and our critical infrastructure. The Darwin port decision, for example, was mind-bogglingly stupid, and defence should have picked that up. But we're learning as we're going, and I think that the Chinese infiltration of our universities with those PLA officers was something that opened our eyes. And so Foreign Investment Review Board and the associated policies that went with that, I think, are now starting to give us some degree of saying, well, look, no, we're not going to sell off the farm to the Chinese, because they will use those resources to their own interests. Yeah, we get rich, but at the end of the day, we lose if they can then win in a war and then they dictate terms to us. And I wouldn't want to see that future for this country.
We've got another question here.
Does Australia have a strategic plan for critical infrastructure such as ports, airfields, and the like to prevent foreign investment and control long-term of those assets?
Yes, we do, and I think it's still in. It's a plan that's essentially been developed over time. Ultimately, at the end of the day, in a national crisis, of course, we can kick the Chinese out of Darwin. But we do have to be smarter in how we manage Chinese investments. Chinese tried to buy dominant control of Ausgrid, for example, which is the East Coast electricity grid. We said no. Chinese wanted Huawei to be the dominant provider of 5G. We said no. They didn't like it, but we were right to do so, because the last thing we would want would be a peer adversary controlling our critical infrastructure. So we do need to develop that policy and continue to enforce it.
So is that a tacit or an explicit plan that you are currently working on? Or something?
So is it a tacit or?
Is it a tacit plan that is an unwritten rule, or is it something that is an actual policy?
Oh, it's actual policy. It's out there in the open.
Go on up the bed.
Yeah, g'day. Look, India is the world's largest democracy, and you spoke about the axis between China and Russia. How do you see India fitting into that?
Well, we would hope through organisations like the Quad that India would not necessarily align with us, because I don't think that's what they want, but they would cooperate and engage with us. It's slow going in that regard because they're a cautious power. They are still, I think, trying to pursue a fairly neutral, non-aligned posture. So we just have to be sort of patient and work with them and engage with them wherever possible. But I don't think the Indians, for example, would feel happy with China having a large military presence in the Indian Ocean. So there are opportunities for us to work with the Indians, and they will grow over time. It's slow going, but we're patient.
Go ahead. We'll take this one up here first.
We hear a lot of bankers and financial planners talking about the impact on the global economy of the trade war between the US and China. How effective do you see a strategy of trade war as opposed to kinetic war in trying to manage Chinese influence?
Look, I don't think a trade war really helps either side, but clearly we can't continue to allow the Chinese to use unfair trade practices. So I think this is one area where I think President Trump was right to push back. Now, whether the trade war is actually going to achieve anything at the end of the day, I'm not convinced. But nevertheless, we couldn't just continue to allow them free rein. Obviously, no one wants kinetic war. I don't think either side are going to rush into that. But the risk is that in terms of kinetic war, the scenario would be that the Chinese decide to do something to retake Taiwan, and the US comes to Taiwan's assistance, and that it goes from there and includes Australia and other US allies. And I think that's the scenario we need to be planning for, not that somehow the trade war will turn into a kinetic war.
I think we had one down here somewhere.
Do you think Australia will start looking at nuclear power, both for electricity generation and propulsion? We're very slow in getting into that game.
Look, my view on nuclear is that we should be having a strong and robust debate about it. We should not be clamping down or preventing discussion of this issue. We are facing a severe climate change risk. It's a good thing that we're embracing renewables. That focus on renewables shouldn't be at the cost of blackouts in our cities. And the challenge with nuclear is getting that up and running, and the cost of getting that up and running. We can't continue to go on with fossil fuels. So I think a combination of renewables, wherever possible, and nuclear, if necessary, is important for discussion in terms of the civil power grid. In terms of propulsion, yes, I'm all for nuclear power and propulsion for submarines. I think that we need to transition to that reasonably quickly, rather than continue with conventional submarines. The first conventional submarine, the first of the attack submarines, is not going to turn up until 2035. So that's a long time away. So we have an opportunity now to have a discussion about how we transition from the attack class conventional submarines to some sort of nuclear powered boat down the track. That, to suggest that the attack class as a conventional submarine will be regionally superior is nonsense. It can't be regionally superior to nuclear powered and propelled submarines, and so we need to get on the nuclear powered and propelled submarines capability as soon as possible. And I know that there's been a discussion in the think tank commentariat about nuclear weapons. I don't favour nuclear weapons. I don't think that we're at that point yet where we have to consider it. And probably if we did get to that point, it would be too late anyhow. So let's not put that on the table at this point.
I think we might have one. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Hello, Malcolm. One of the threads that you raised was the pace of defence acquisitions, and at times how slow that can be. As you can appreciate, often that's linked back to the Department and Parliament's appetite for risk, which is sort of appropriate noting where we are this week. In your view, what sort of strategic shock would be required to make the government take the sort of risk or entertain those risks necessary to speed up the acquisition cycle and as respond in the timeframes we probably need to? Thank you.
Good question. Look, you can answer it two ways. One would be suddenly a major conflict breaking out on the Korean Peninsula in the coming years that would require Australian military involvement, and we suffer losses, and so suddenly we're faced with a need to accelerate our acquisition plans to recover capability. And that would be probably one scenario that would be a shock to our political leaders, that we can't just rip forward and assume nothing is going to happen in the 2020s that we need to be worried about, so therefore we can wait until 2035 and the submarines will be fine. The other possibility is that we do get the strong, hard message from Washington that they do expect us to burden share to a greater degree, and they do expect us to do more. And so therefore we suddenly have to think about, okay, we're going to need to not only expand and update the defence force structure that was planned for in the 2016 white paper, but we're going to need to do it faster than a 20-year acquisition cycle. I suppose a third scenario would be if the Chinese develop something that fundamentally changes the game. And I'm not even talking hypersonic weapons, I'm talking something more revolutionary and transformational, in the same way that nuclear weapons transformed war in 1945. If that happens, then we have to go back to basic first principles and start thinking, okay, what do we need to do now? So those are the sort of scenarios I'm thinking of, but at the moment we seem to be content with this very long acquisition cycle that's going to see the first of the attack class submarines appear 2034-35. We won't get the 12th until 2050. And the nature of undersea warfare is going to be so radically different by the end of the 2020s that you have to wonder whether those attack class submarines are going to be fit for purpose. And the second thing is that by the time we get those first attack class submarines, the strategic shape of the region could have been determined in the 2020s by a series of conflicts that go against us. So it is definitely taking too long to get those future submarines, in my opinion.
Got another one up the back here?
Hello, how are you? Building on some of the conversation that's been had, that we've had with regards to financial markets, over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of growth in the property sector, which arguably has been fueled by Chinese investment. One could argue that property market is pretty heavily inflated at the moment, and if something was to happen in that regard, there are a lot of people who are very heavily leveraged in that respect. Is noting that there has been a lot of impact from China, perhaps in inflating that market, is that something that comes into the equation with regards to China's influence from a defence point of view?
You should be asking a property expert, not a strategic analyst. I'm sorry, I couldn't speculate. I mean, if something bad happened, there was a war, and the Chinese put out all their investments, of course the Australian economy is going to be hurt hard. And I think the way around that is to diversify our partners as much as possible. Don't be so reliant on Chinese investment, either for the raw materials like heavy industry, or for Chinese university students or tourism. We need to diversify our trading partners, basically. But I couldn't talk about the property side of things. That's like explosive ordnance safety. I'd be completely speaking out of my head if I said something like that.
Thank you.
This one's actually going to be for me. I guess we've got 300 years of global powers facing off against each other, and apart from the 7 Years' War and World War I and World War II, most of that tension has been played out through proxy conflicts. And so I'm curious why we still focus so heavily on the major powers conflicts here.
Well, we had a major power conflict from 1939 to 1945, from 1914 to 1918. You go back into the 19th century with the Napoleonic Wars and so forth. And you could argue we had major power conflict in the Cold War. It's just that the two sides weren't actively fighting one another. I don't see any evidence to suggest that that trend won't continue, that you won't have major powers fighting one another in the future. If the interest is important enough and the potential gains are there and they take a gamble and think they can get away with it, as I said, think in mind of the Taiwan scenario or the Korean Peninsula scenario, or in the case of Europe, the Russians moving against the Baltic states to try and impose a capitulation by NATO, then yeah, it'll happen. I mean, it's not that far back when NATO was quite prepared to use substantial numbers of nuclear weapons on its own territory to defeat a Warsaw Pact invasion. So, you know, just because we had a period of relative peace in the 1990s, and then there was this kind of interruption of focus on international terrorism after 9/11, doesn't mean that the threat of major power interstate war is finished. I think that's what Francis Fukuyama got wrong. He was basically saying, well, we won the Cold War, we never need to worry about this again because surely no one will be that stupid as to go to war. Human beings are stupid animals. They will do stupid things. And yes, we could have major power interstate war, including nuclear war. And that's something we also need to think about.
One more down in front of you.
You mentioned before about the general Chinese population being reluctant to join the PLA. Do you think, should a conflict arise between Taiwan and China, would the economic market go down enough that they realise the prosperous state of the nation would go the other way, and that it would generate enough, I guess, dissent to overturn the CCP?
Look, I think there's two sides to this. On the one hand, you do have young people who are very much focused on prosperity and gaining wealth and that sort of thing, and so probably you would get some that would not want to go to war over Taiwan. But you know, the Chinese Communist Party play this in nationalist terms, and they portray Taiwan as an indivisible part of China that they must recover for the China dream to be achieved. You know, President Xi, when he talks, basically says we are committed to recovering Taiwan. And he doesn't talk about, you know, decades in the future, he's talking about in the next few years. So I think that if you had a scenario whereby, for example, Chinese economic growth was slowing, there was more unrest as a result of that, Xi might be tempted to turn the nationalist card and say, okay, now we're going after Taiwan. And the question then is, would you get broad support in China for that? I think you probably would, because Taiwan is different from other things. The Chinese probably wouldn't be prepared to support a war against India, for example, but Taiwan is different.
One comment, the United States is a republic, basically the powers are split between the legislative branch and the executive branch. They see it goes too far one way, the legislative branch, the Senate, clear rules. So basically, I think the economy turns down and basically things get wrong on the executive branch and change.
Yeah, you may be right. Obviously, the executive branch and the commander-in-chief can basically get the US to act in self-defense. So there's a grey area there, but you're right. In terms of declaring war, it's only the Congress that can do that. Now, they haven't declared war in a very long time. I believe the last time they declared war was 1941. So, you know, it's a case of how an executive would use its power to undertake military operations, say, against Iran or North Korea, and then go to Congress for authorization. It's the War Powers Act.
Got the last question up the back there.
So, noting your comments on nuclear propulsion for Australia, I'd be interested to understand why you're opposed to a nuclear-armed Australia when you've said that we should diverse from American protection, invest in nuclear power in Australia.
Okay, firstly, I never say never. There would be dire circumstances when we should debate that issue. But my concern is that by the time we get to that point, it's too late. We won't have the means to develop the delivery systems or the warheads, and we have to think about not only that, but also the command and control. Nuclear command and control is an entirely different level of complexity compared to traditional conventional command and control. So, and then we have to think about strategy. How do we use these capabilities? Are we going to have a counter-value strategy or a counter-force strategy? If we have counter-value, we're nuking cities. And that's a really challenging decision to make compared to a discrete precision nuclear strike on a military complex. We also have to sell it to the Australian people. And Australian people by nature are anti-nuclear. They don't like anything with nuclear in it. So trying to get the Australian people to agree to this would be really challenging. And that's why I'm saying the question of nuclear weapons for Australia would only really come up if our circumstances were really dire. And by that I mean the US is completely off the board. They're not there to support us whatsoever. And we have an aggressive nuclear-armed adversary on our doorstep. And then I think, yes, we would need to think about that. But the problems would be that we wouldn't really have enough time to acquire that capability in an effective manner. I'm all for nuclear power and propulsion submarines. I am for consideration of nuclear power for a civil industry. But that final step of getting nuclear weapons is really challenging. And it would also go against Australia's foreign policy in terms of being supportive of the NPT and so forth. So a lot of things would have to go really bad for us to get to that point.
Can I ask just one last thing for the audience, good audience of existing and emerging military, government and industry leaders here? What's the best way for them to get engaged with this topic and debate moving forward just through their daily work?
Look, let me engage in some flagrant self-promotion here. Read the ASPI Strategist blog. It's Australia's best blog on defence and national security affairs, in my opinion. Every day we have good articles on a range of issues, not just the high-level strategic stuff, but also capability and industry and so forth. So read the ASPI Strategist blog, come to ASPI events, more self-promotion. We've got an ASPI Space Policy Masterclass coming up in December, which is really well worth attending. So if you want to understand war on the high frontier, come and listen to that there. And Steve and I are both presenting at that.
Beautiful.
But no, I think what you need to do is engage with the defence media community, read journals, go to conferences, watch online debates. I've found that out of all the social media platforms, Twitter is the most useful in terms of understanding debates on defence and strategic policy issues because it's so current and up to date. I also use LinkedIn quite a bit for the same purpose. So that's Twitter and LinkedIn I think are really useful.
Cool. All right, well, Malcolm, look, thanks very much. We can all be very guilty of focusing down onto our piece of the puzzle. So it's great to have an opportunity, with a speaker like yourself to sort of get up and have a look at the whole picture. So if the audience could show their appreciation, please.